Hello Form, it's a Crazy Spider here, doing my first in-depth game analysis of the Resistance series. For all of you who are new to the Resistance universe, the Resistance series is a first-person shooter game that was originally based around an alternate World War II history. This game was developed by Insomniac, one of my personal favorite game developers. All of the games in the Resistance series are PS3 exclusives, and the first one was released in November 2006. The Resistance series prides itself on being a unique shooter where all the weapons are a little bit over the top and each have a primary and secondary fire. In the first and third games, they also allow the player to hold a wide arsenal of these weapons all at the same time, allowing the player to play through the game with a wide arsenal of weapons, giving them multiple options when engaging in different scenarios. In the Resistance games, every encounter was different. You engaged the enemies based upon what weapons you had, how much ammo you had, and even the positions you were against the enemies. If the enemies had the high ground, you might have had to use one weapon. If the enemies were below you, you could have used another. It all depended on the situation and how you wanted to attack it. Being thrown into tons of different situations, you were able to experiment with all of your weapons, trying out their new primary and secondary fires to create massive havoc in these enemies, involving many guns that had very ridiculous abilities, including a rocket launcher that could fire, stop in midair, redirect, and blow the heck out of anything that got in its way. When the original Resistance game came out, it really shocked the gaming community. People were overtaken by this game's ability to draw you in, make you feel like you were Nathan Hale, wielding your carbine, mowing down the Chimera as they ran towards you, and feeling the emotions that he went through in this game, trying to save the world from a threat that was almost unstoppable. Now that you've been acquainted with the Resistance series, I can start to talk to you about the best parts, the worst parts, and everything in between about these games. The Resistance series consists of 3 console titles and a couple of PlayStation Portable titles, which I will not be covering in this video. Those 3 games are Resistance Fall of Man, Resistance 2, and Resistance 3. Each game has its ups and downs. Resistance 1 had the best impact value, Resistance 2 had the best multiplayer with 60 on 60 matches, and Resistance 3 had some of the most satisfying and rewarding combat in the series. This is not to say that each game did not have its flaws. Resistance 1 was the best of the series in my opinion. Yes, it had a few glitchy bugs and texture problems here and there, but its real only problem was the awkward iron sight mechanic that not very many people liked. Resistance 2, on the other hand, was probably the worst of the series. I'm not going to say it was a bad game, because the game was very entertaining and the multiplayer was a lot of fun, including the co-op, but the game had some serious balance issues. Some of the weapons were just ridiculously better than all the other ones, and you couldn't use them at all. Resistance 3 falls into the middle here. Yes, they fixed the balance issues and all the guns seem to be useful and rightfully in their own place, but now the story was lackluster. It didn't really matter how much you wanted to connect to the character. It was really hard to. For some reason, the connection there wasn't as existent as it had been in the past. Okay, now that I've talked about a few of the negatives of each game, now I can talk about what happened as the series evolved, why it got better, and why it got worse. Every game had its own character, its own flavor. Resistance 1 felt more survival horror. Resistance 2 felt more superhero, destroy everything. And Resistance 3 felt more like a man on the run with nothing to lose and fighting for his life and his family. The odd thing about this, though, is because these games had such different feels, it almost felt like they were disconnected in some way that they really shouldn't have been. It's odd when comparing a series like Resistance to a series such as Halo, where Halo has a very consistent feel that is always the same and always holds the same feel to it, but then all of a sudden Resistance goes, oh, I'm going to change to this, I'm going to change to that, and it has this awkward moment where you're not really sure if it's the same type of game. And therein lies my biggest flaw with the Resistance series. It isn't consistent. The gameplay falls along different lines in each game, and you feel like you're playing separate games as opposed to playing a continuation of the last game. The way I believe Insomniac should have handled the experience would be for them to continuate off the experience of Resistance 1, to continue that experience of a fight that you are fighting against an almost unstoppable energy, pushing and pushing, doing your best to make every impact you can. Not to keep being a Debbie Downer here, but another thing that really bugged me about the Resistance series is after the first game, the stories dropped dramatically. The story of Resistance 1 was much better than the rest, but was also told in a unique and interesting narrative, told in a third-person perspective from another person who Nathan Hale had met along his journeys. She recapped his story as opposed to that story being told from Nathan's perspective. This gave a unique feel and experience to the first Resistance. Resistance 2 was told through Nathan's own personal experiences and what he was doing at all times, which gave it its own more stereotypical first-person shooter feel. The third game was slightly different. It kind of mixed the two from Resistance 1 and Resistance 2. It was told in a second-person perspective, both going in and out of the first person of the main character and third person involving people outside of the character. The first game's story was great. The second game's story was forgettable and boring, whereas the third game's story really struck me as odd. The third story was good. It made sense. It flowed. It fit the series, but for some reason, I felt a major disconnection from the character as I played the game. Maybe it's because I didn't feel for the character as much. Nathan Hale, because because he was nearly silent, I almost felt like I was him. I almost felt like I was that character. But playing as the new protagonist, I felt like he had his own personality, and I just was disconnected, like I was moving him through the actions as opposed to what I'd done in the previous games. Well, okay, enough talking about how Resistance kind of failed as a series. Let's talk about a few of the things they did right that I really loved about Resistance, as its beginning and at its end. Resistance's gameplay mechanics were extremely good, both in the first, middle, and last game. Every time you played, the controls felt tight, responsive, and things worked the way they should have. One of the things that I really loved about Resistance was the AI in the game. Some of the AIs in the game were very simple, but the standard hybrids that you fought a lot had a very complex AI that would take cover, charge you, retreat, move, adjust, all dependent upon you and what you do. This brings me to my next favorite point about Resistance, is it was challenging. This challenge seems to be lost in a lot of modern games, and it really makes me sad, because when I play a game, I don't play a game to walk through it and breeze through it. I want to feel like I've accomplished something at the end, like the reason I defeated that final boss was because I am now a super-powered human who can destroy anything with his fists. Or guns or weapons or whatever. It doesn't really matter what you were using, but the reason I brought this up is because Resistance kept me in that place where it challenged me. It made me try new things. It made me attempt things I would have never thought of before because I was looking for a way to solve the puzzle. The game respected your intelligence. It didn't make you sit through boring tutorials that you had to do. In the first and second games, it just dropped you in the fight and kind of displayed at the bottom of the screen the buttons you needed to use, but that was it. You went right into the fight. Unfortunately, though, in the third game, though, you were stuck at a tutorial thing, and I hated it. But other than that one tutorial, it expected you to learn on your own, play the game, figure it out, and be an amazing hero in your own ways, on your own time. This is one of the reasons I love Resistance, is that feel of challenge, that feel of success when you finally defeated that boss because you couldn't figure it out before. The reason I loved this challenge was because the weapons allowed you to try it in so many ways. You could go back and play the game a completely different way than you did before with these new and crazy weapons they gave you. Personally, my favorite gun in the game was the Hailstorm, which was an amazing machine gun that shot ricocheting bullets that bounced all over the walls and the enemies shooting around, darting in every which way, killing everything in sight. And its secondary fire was a deployed turret that auto-shot these same bullets at enemies, allowing you to place that turret in key locations in order to take out enemies that you didn't want to expose yourself to, which was amazing and so useful. Insomniac really went out on a limb when they created all these weird weapons to be put in the game that do amazing and bizarre things. Weapons like that had never really been done in a first-person shooter before, so all these bizarre concepts of being able to shoot a rocket into the air and redirect it, or shoot a bullet out in front of you, split it into 20 more bullets, and then launch all those forward at once, was really bizarre and fun. And that's where Resistance's key fun comes from, those bizarre weapons where you can do different things, change different things, adjust and shoot and do crazy and amazing things, all with a simple concept, and that's what I wish more games had. And last but not least, one of my favorite things about Resistance was the weapon wheel. It only existed in Resistance 1 and Resistance 3. Resistance 2 went for the standard you have two weapons and you can switch between them feel. But in Resistance 1 and 3, you have an arsenal of weapons at your disposal at any one time. You collect them as you play through the story, but by the end of the story, you can hold up to 10, 12 weapons, and it feels great when you can pull out a new weapon, destroy an enemy, pull out another one, fire a rocket, stop it in midair, aim it somewhere else, and pull out your bullseye, tag an enemy, shoot him 100,000 times until he falls over, and the game is just so much fun. Part of the reason for this entertainment was because Resistance, although being a linear game, portrayed a very strong illusion of open worldness, because these levels were not all narrow corridors like a lot of the Call of Duty games are, but instead oftentimes puts a player into a war zone, giving them multiple options and ways to go, because this war zone is very open. They have multiple choices in different ways, each one has its own benefits and consequences. As I look back at the Resistance series, it'd be a lie to say I wouldn't change anything. There are definitely a few tweaks that I would want to make here and there, specifically involving carrying the weapons from the first games over. The most creative and innovative weapons existed in the first game, but unfortunately the second and third games kind of ignored a lot of the most entertaining ones, including the Hailstorm and the Sapper. These kind of bizarre, over-the-top weapons define the series in my opinion. And yes, there were a lot of really cool weapons in both Resistance 3 and Resistance 2 that had their own unique and fun fires and secondary fires, including a saw gun that its secondary fire charged up a saw blade that stuck into an enemy and spun around in him a whole bunch. But there was something lost when a lot of these weapons didn't carry over into the other games, or they decided just not to put them there for whatever reason. I also probably would have driven the story home a bit more in the second and third games because they didn't quite portray the story as well as the first game did. Maybe adjusted the way the story was told, similar to that of the first game. Lastly, I know I talked about this before, but I would have liked to have kept the experiences between all three games a bit more alike. That feel of survival, that fear of push, that feel of going for it, trying to defeat an enemy was great in the first game, and I wish the second and third games could have done the same. Now it's time to break it all down into little bite-sized chunks, just in case you weren't listening for the rest of the video. The Resistance series prides itself on being a little bit off from the norm by using very crazy weapons and concepts to portray its game very well. Although the series did not portray a very similar experience throughout all the games, it still was very fun and each game held its own qualities. The first game had a few minor bugs, the second game had a real solid balance issue with the game, and the third game was really just lackluster along the story department. But in the end, the success of Resistance really outweighs the flaws. The entertaining gameplay of the weapon wheel and being able to destroy things and shoot things and do all sorts of crazy shenanigans with the weapons you have far outweighs the negatives that the game does have at times. If you're looking for a gaming series that will challenge you, make you feel like you accomplished something, and make you feel like a superhuman badass at times, look at the Resistance series. It's one of the better ones out there, and I enjoy it a lot. Well, for all of you who are still awake, I hope you enjoyed my in-depth analysis of the Resistance series, and remember, you're only sane if you admit that you're a little bit crazy. This has been A Crazy Spider. I'm out.